Well, good morning. Glad to see all of you. Let me just begin by saying this study is going to be sort of difficult for several reasons. One is it's a difficult subject matter that we're talking about, and people have strong emotions and opinions associated with it, and we're all connected to people that are sort of caught up in this what we will talk about as the rise of the modern self and expression. We all have LGBTQ IA plus friends, and we're connected to people, and our purpose here is certainly, well, the truth is our purpose is simply to know truth. We just want to know what the biblical worldview is, because once you become a follower of Jesus, the truth is you give up all of your own thinking to say, I'm surrendering and submitting myself to this external authority, which is the Word of God. And I have much more understanding of and even intellectual respect for someone who just completely denies the Bible and says, well, I just don't accept that. That has no authority over me, and I totally reject it. I can understand that. What I can't understand are the people who claim to be followers of Jesus and are Christians who then dissect it and say, well, I take this part and not that part. To me, that's just intellectual dishonesty. I don't understand that. So we're going to be using as a sort of a textbook. I like my sweet spot. What I like teaching is books of the Bible. That's what I've trained to do, and it's what I love doing. It's what I typically do, and that's what we always do without fail. That's what we do in our worship services. Our classes are meant for discipleship and to teach us things, and it certainly involves the way we apply the Bible to certain things. So, this is why we have Sunday school classes on things like marriage and parenting and the rise and triumph of the modern self, because what we're doing is talking about how to apply biblical truth to areas of our lives and areas of our culture. I really recommend you get Carl Trueman. He's written 2 books on this subject. He is a professor at Grove City College, which is a Christian college in Pennsylvania, and formerly a professor at, I think, Westminster Theological Seminary, PCA school. And Carl Trueman went to, I'm trying to remember, he went to Aberdeen, was it? I can't remember if he went to Aberdeen or St. Andrews, but he was roommates with a friend of mine who's a Brazilian there, and so I've sort of been connected to him through the years. His book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is really, it's 400 pages long. It's really intellectually dense, and in that he very carefully traces the philosophical underpinnings of where we are today. Like how did we get here where truth is determined by your feelings? That didn't just happen overnight. There's been a history that got us here. How did we get here? And so he wrote that book, and his friend Ryan Anderson, who we've had here at Buck Run before, we did a Family Foundation event, and Ryan Anderson spoke here at that. Ryan Anderson is the author of When Harry Became Sally. I would tell you to go on Amazon and get that book, but guess what? Amazon took it down. Amazon won't sell that book. Now, there's nothing in that book hateful. It is a well-reasoned academic dissection of the whole transgender debate, and yet transgender people claim they've been hurt by it. And this is where we are, that our culture that has been a classically liberal culture, and I use that in the broadest sense of the word, not in liberal versus conservative, but liberal as in freedom of speech and of thought and of engagement and debate. That is disappearing in our country. It's going away. And the fact that you can't buy Ryan Anderson's book on Amazon, to me, is just it's an indication of where we're going. That it's just what we have studied in Romans 1, that there is a suppression of truth. And there's not intellectual engagement with it. There's only screaming. It's funny, I'm reading people writing on the left right now. This has nothing to do with this particular subject, but reading people on the left saying, look how all these conservatives are just screaming about the FBI in Mar-a-Lago and stuff. And they go, that's all they do is they just show immediate rage and enragement at stuff. And I'm like, that's not one side of the debate doing that. This is where our culture is. It's like, instead of intellectual debate and engagement and let's talk about the facts, it's just where we claim that we've been hurt, we're not in a safe space, and that teenagers are committing suicide because you believe that, and that's sort of where we are. And when Amazon will take complaints from the very, very small minority of Americans who are transgender because they feel violated by Ryan Anderson's very solid book, it just sort of shows you where we are. Well, Ryan Anderson suggested to Carl Trueman that the typical layperson can't read your book. It's too theologically or intellectually dense, because he goes through the whole intellectual, the traces Western philosophy basically that gets us here. And so he wrote another book, and this is not merely a restatement. There's new stuff in this book. If you really want to wade into it, get Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I guarantee you Linda Ormsby has read that book. Linda Ormsby thrives on this stuff. It's really a good book. But most people would do better reading Strange New World. And it's sort of the same contours, not exactly the same stuff, but enough. And this is what we're going to follow, even though we've titled the course the other book because it's a little bit more descriptive of what we're going to be talking about. But I would encourage you to get this and sort of read along, and because you can go back and reread it, and you can look at his footnotes, and you can look up other stuff if you want. But we're going to sort of work our way through this for about 6 weeks. And if you get this, you can still get this on Amazon, I think. And I think we've got some out there. I don't know if we've sold out last week, and I think we might have gotten more. But you should be able to get that on Amazon by tomorrow if you are an Amazon Prime member. But this is, Christians can't just ignore it. You know, we cannot be silent about it, because I'm seeing people in churches argue and debate stuff that really 10 years from now is not going to be a thing. But I'm telling you, this isn't going away. Now, let me tell you at the very outset, I'm incredibly hopeful, because frankly, this won't work. It simply won't work. And now you're watching when, like, you look at just the LGBT, well, look, LGB, those three letters assume gender, right? You can't be LG or B unless you accept gender. And then you got T and Q, and now they're adding pluses. I forget. You want a fascinating study? Read about the history of the flag, the LGBTQ flag. They came in. It's controversial. So what happens is now that they had a common enemy in everybody that was against any of this movement. But now that they're sort of winning, now they're turning on each other. This is why you've got like Martina Navratilova, who is a married lesbian and yet says transgender women should not compete in women's sports. It's wrong. And for this, she got booted off the board of Nike. And I mean, she who was the champion of the LGB people for years, because here she was, a professional athlete who was a lesbian and stood for gay rights. Buddy, she didn't go far enough, and now she's out. She's totally rejected. Look at what they've done to J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is no Christian apologist by any stretch, the author of the Harry Potter books. And yet she simply says that, women, a man who becomes a woman has not had the same experience as a woman. And if a man becomes a woman and he gets a job, then he took that job away from women. And just because she said that, again, she's out. The last Harry Potter movie that came out, which was about two gay wizards, read every single review. I challenge you to find any review of that movie that does not mention her personal views about the transgender stuff. Now, you would think that should have nothing to do with whether the movie's a good movie or a bad movie, but every single review has to talk about her personal views. And so this is where our culture is. They're marking people. Either you're going along with the revolution or you're not. And if you're not, we are going to intimidate you. We're going to ostracize you. We're going to make you pay. And then they wonder why people on the right are furious. And I'm not defending anybody who ever gets violent or in any way. I'm just saying that you're seeing in our culture these, on the fringes of both sides, there's rage and there's this self-expression that says my way is the right way, and I'm going to, and anybody else that thinks differently, I'm going to ostracize, hurt, wound, whatever, whether physically, literally, or emotionally and socially. There was an article in the New York Times this week. I take that back. It was July the 20th by Eva Goldfarb and Lisa Lieberman, who are professors of public health at Montclair State University. And listen to this. This is in the New York Times. Religious right political groups that have spent decades dismantling abortion rights in much of the country have been gunning for sex education for just as long. Their dangerous and cynical efforts now appear under the guise of, and let's put this in scare quotes, parental rights and school transparency on the floors of state legislatures and at school board meetings. I just want you to hear this. It's on the pages of the New York Times, and parental rights is like not a real thing. We got to put it in scare quotes. I mean, on the basis of parental rights, these people are daring to get involved in our educating our children in the sexual revolution. Listen to the way they describe their view versus the other view. High quality, evidence-informed sex education is critically important, effective, and supported by an overwhelming majority of Americans. All right, first of all, who's against high quality, evidence-informed sex education? Is like, well, who would say, no, I'm against that? But by the way, what evidence are they talking about? Evidence-informed? They're not talking about DNA. Because DNA tells you there's an X and there's a Y. And they're not talking about anatomy, because anatomy tells you there are two different kinds of genitalia. And what do they mean by evidence-informed? Sadly, sex education is on shaky ground in many parts of the United States. Florida's Don't Say Gay law, which, by the way, Florida did not pass a law called Don't Say Gay. They passed a law saying that sex education for first, second, and third graders needed to be appropriate to their age. And of course, the left puts on it the moniker, "Don't say gay." And it was just anyway, this is what they do, which went into effect this month and denies students in younger grades the opportunity to learn about gender identity and sexual orientation, was just one of many recent state bills seeking to restrict access to comprehensive sex education. While groups pushing these laws argue that such instruction puts children at risk of sexual exploitation, our research has found that comprehensive, medically accurate sex ed, in fact, protects them. Now, again, you just want to say, okay, what are you talking about? Medically accurate sex ed, because, well, I'd be all for that, but that is not what is happening. And this is one of the reasons why we need to talk about this, because if you're not paying attention, your language is being used in such a way to totally obfuscate what's going on. And when they talk about that, you ask the majority of Americans, do you believe in evidence-informed, medically accurate sex education for kids? Nobody's going to go, no, I'm against that. I want that unfactual, mythological stuff. No one's going to do that. But what they mean by medically informed and accurate is not based on science. I mean, there is no science that separates the body from gender. I mean, it just does not exist. And so the question that we want to talk about is, how do we get here, and what do we as Christians do about it? Well, let's remember that, first of all, I'm not one who says, the world is worse than it's ever been. Keep in mind that we've always been in a totally depraved world. In the United States, we've been spoiled. We've got a few hundred years here of an incredible window of religious freedom like the world has never seen. And we've had it good, and we've gotten accustomed to that. And so now that we're sort of going through what the church has gone through for centuries, in most places in the world, we're going, hey, wait a minute. And it's a tragedy for our country, but let's not think we've got it worse than any Christians have ever had it, or we're facing stuff Christians have never faced. It's different in our country, that's for sure. It's different here than it's been. But the church has always thrived in persecution. And I believe that you're going to see a purification of the Lord's church, because there aren't going to be false professing Christians showing up on Sundays anymore. It's not going to happen, because there's no advantage to it. It used to be, you go to church on Sunday, in a small, Podunk, Kentucky, it helps you with your business because you know people and you got connections, and that's going to be gone. There won't be any advantage to it. So it's people who are really showing up to worship Jesus that are going to be showing up. And I think there's going to be a strength in that. The other thing is, as I told you at the beginning, I'm convinced it cannot last, because it's totally contra reality. And once the self becomes the arbiter of truth, then you've got anarchy ultimately, and it just can't work. It can't last. We look in the book of Judges. What's the theme of the book of Judges? Every man did what? That which was right in his eyes. Remember that. It's not that everybody was doing what they knew to be wrong. It's that they were all doing what they thought was right. It was right, but in whose eyes? In their own eyes. And that's where we are. We're in a culture that encourages you to do that which is right in your own eyes. So how do we get here? Well, Carl Trueman he begins by talking about what is the self. Okay, who are you? Where is the real me to be found? And so Trueman, let me read a paragraph from him. He says, perhaps This is best expressed by a series of questions. Am I, for example, to be understood primarily in terms of my obligations toward and dependence upon others? So am I a husband, a father, a grandfather, a pastor? But do I define myself based on those relationships to others? Does education consist in training me in the demands and expectations of the wider culture and forming me, shaping me into that which will serve the community at large? So, when I was in elementary school, South Christian Elementary, we were taught citizenship. It was a thing. You were taught how to be a good citizen and the responsibilities of citizenship and how you fit into the culture and what are your responsibilities. And so he says, is that what education is for? Is growing up a process by which I learn to control my feelings, to act with restraint, and and sacrifice my desires to those of the community around me? Or am I to understand myself as born free and able to create my own identity? Does education consist in enabling me to express outwardly that which I feel inwardly? Is growing up a process not of learning restraint, but rather of capitalizing on opportunities to perform? My conviction is that the normative self of today, the typical way in which we think of our identity, is one who answers those last three questions in the affirmative. That is, in other words, that today the idea of self has now shifted from this person who fits in these relationships, is defined by relationships and responsibilities, to now it's about me discovering who I am, living out who I am, and not in learning restraint, but in capitalizing opportunities. This is the modern self. Well, where'd that come from? And he cites Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, who talks about expressive individualism. And Taylor says that our job in life, our goal in life, should be to be the authentic self. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Taylor says we should create a culture of authenticity. I can't be authentic if I don't express myself truly, who I am. And so he defines authenticity as non-conformity, 4 specific ways. He said there should be no imposition from outside. You have to find yourself. You manifest your destiny. No imposition from society. Gender expectations or a binary world. He says there can be no imposition from society. Society cannot force you to fit into any of these categories. No imposition from the previous generation. You have to break free from the way our parents and grandparents did it, and there should be no imposition from religion and politics. Religion imposes order, and politics limits expression. And you just look at this. This is precisely what our culture is trying to do. You watch people, and they don't want to thank God. They'll thank the universe, or the universe gave me a gift today. They talk about being spiritual without being religious. They want to separate spirituality from any concept of God. And even the defund police, I think, is that way of thinking is precisely tied to this. Is like, we don't want any kind of imposition of order from the outside. Leave it to us. Now, we all sit here and going, yeah, that does not work. And it will have awful consequences. And it did, in fact, in places where they sort of did that. Terrible consequences. And yet that's sort of what you see is we want to throw off any responsibility to any outside influence. So this is Charles Taylor, and he's saying that this is the expressive individualism, that you have to express who you are. We look around us and we say, okay, there's clearly a sexual revolution going on, but what do we mean by that? In the 60s, the sexual revolution was like the throwing off of sexual morals. But what is happening today is not just, okay, you can have, free love and you're not bound, you're free to have sex outside of marriage. Rather, it's the repudiation of the very idea of any kind of sexual codes at all. So that not only can you have, you're free to have multiple partners, you're free to not even be in any kind of a sexual category. And you can be you can be non-binary. You can be neither male nor female, or I'm male some days and female other days. I don't know. I forget I can't keep up with all the current singers and stuff. But there was one pretty well-known singer currently who recently changed her pronouns to they and them, and then came out last week and said no, she's going back to her, and. You're seeing even some on the left now are sort of getting over the pronoun thing. Already there's sort of a backlash against it from the very people that instigated it. It's because, again, this doesn't work, and it's just so clumsy and crazy. I really do think in 20 years we'll look back on that, it's like, that was nuts. That just can't last. And you think it's tough in English. Try it in a Romance language where every single noun has gender. And suddenly you're trying to change the entire language. Akadata, the chair, now what are we going to do? You have a male definite article and a feminine definite article, masculine and feminine definite article. It's got to be one or the other, and what are you going to do with the chair? How are you going to make it neutral and neuter? And it's going crazy, and yet even in those Latin countries, that's happening. Today, what the sexual revolution has gotten down to is that wrong sexual behaviors are defined only by lack of consent. But even that's tricky, because I watched this week a video for a psychologist arguing that children, by the way, and I've said all along this is where it was going to go. If a 9-year-old can determine their gender, then the 9-year-old is also competent to determine whether or not they should have sexual activity. I mean, you think about it. You can't say, okay, we're going to trust our 9-year-old to transition from one gender to the other, but then tell them they can't have sex. I mean, once you take away the scare quotes parental rights and you give autonomy to a 9-year-old, how are you going to then argue that, okay, we can't let the 9-year-old decide for himself, herself, theirselves if they want to have sex with an adult? And so the notion that even a child cannot consent is being eroded. And because consent becomes the only guideline, okay, well, you're saying a 17-year-old can't consent, but an 18-year-old can't, and you're just seeing that eroded. And there's a fear in our culture to just confront the truth. The whole monkeypox thing. Again, I encourage you, do this on your time. Don't do it in church this morning. It will get you out of the spirit. Go to the CDC website and read what they've got up about monkeypox. Just the CDC. It is jarring. They say, the vast majority of people getting monkeypox, it's not sexual contact's not the only way to get it. I don't want to suggest that it is, but I'm just looking at the data. It's clearly the dominant way people are getting it, and it's happening among one particular segment of our culture, and it's gay men. That is the bulk of it. And yet, here's the thing, the CDC and all the health departments, I've not yet seen one health department willing to say, we recommend to gay men that they do not engage in promiscuous sex. They will not say it. In fact, they've said we won't say it. They've said, I read one, I think it was San Francisco's health department says, well, it doesn't do any good. Now, we just came out of a global lockdown, and yet they're saying, telling gay men to not have promiscuous sex does no good, so we're not going to say it. I'm like, and you wonder why you're losing credibility with the populace here. You know, in your, oh, we don't want to stigmatize anybody. Well, just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. But that's just not happening. And I've got several doctors sitting here. I don't think I'm saying anything that they would disagree with. I don't want to speak for them. You talk to our doctors. But the fact that they won't just say, don't engage in it, that's risky behavior. It's clearly a major way that monkeypox is being spread. But they won't say, don't do it. Why? Because we can't interfere with anybody's expressive individualism. So Charles Taylor argues, he says that we all become a part of what he calls the social imaginary. How do we get to the point, you know, in the year 1500, atheism was unthinkable. You just really didn't have anybody claiming to be an atheist in the year 1500. All the world's thinkers, everybody were theists, or at the very least deists, but nobody was an atheist. And yet now, in the 2000s, a belief in God seems strange to the culture. How did that happen? Well, there have been a lot of thinkers that have introduced various arguments over the years, but it wasn't that people just stopped believing in God or that they believed in all these academic theories. It's that they had to imagine themselves differently. Secularism didn't arise because modernism stripped away our belief. It's that our social imaginary has been transformed. Our feel for the world, our way of perceiving and reacting to the world without thinking about it has changed. So it's like this. I think, I this morning got up, I went upstairs. I don't understand the electricity. I don't. I know a little bit about it, but I don't get it. I don't know what has to be grounded and, all that. But I turned on my lights. I didn't need to understand electricity to turn on my lights. And I made my little Nespresso in my Nespresso machine. I don't understand all about coffee, but I drank it. And we've come to just accept certain things as part of our cultural or social imaginary. And this is Charles Taylor's argument, is that we place ourselves, we think ourselves in the world differently than they did hundreds of years ago. We've moved from a world where life was unthinkable apart from God to a world where many people think themselves to be God. He uses two words. Mimesis is the idea that the world is given order and meaning, and humans live in this world of order and meaning. Poiesis is the idea that the world is raw material where the individual creates meaning and purpose. Well, as technology has improved and we've sort of dominated our world, we've become less reliant on the inherent order in the world. We've become sort of masters of our own fate technologically. It's caused us to change the way we think. Agriculture, medicine, over the last 500 years changed radically, even over the last 100 years. And this shapes our imaginary. We can imagine life without God because we see ourselves as in control of this raw material that we give order to, we give meaning to. We can imagine life where we create our own meaning. Now, you apply that to sexuality. Think of the things that have happened to create the sexual revolution of the last 60 years. Prior to the last 60 years, sex was seen primarily as a marital benefit for the purpose of procreation, mutual enjoyment. Everybody knew there was certainly extramarital sex, but it was frowned upon. It was never culturally okay. There were literally laws against it. It caused things like war and financial ruin, and it was seen clearly as, okay, we know it happens, but we do everything we can to discourage it. But in the last 60 years, you had Playboy and Hugh Hefner pushing a certain lifestyle. But by the way, now the sexual revolution has turned on him. That lifestyle and what he did now is seen as abusive. The pill, certainly, once you separated sexuality from pregnancy and made it less of a concern, you had a removal further from marriage. Technology, from movies to the internet, I cannot overstate the devastation of pornography, the ubiquity of pornography. When I was young, pornography was finding my neighbor's Playboys in his garage. And it was something you had to go and procure. You had to actually seek it out. It was very limited. Even when you found it, you only found certain things. To see pornographic movies, you actually had to go somewhere or buy something. Beginning, about 20 years ago, it went on the internet and it went free. There's actually a book about when porn went free and how much it changed our culture. And I just can't tell you how many, this isn't a Southern seminary problem. This is a problem in every seminary and Bible college, and it's a problem in every university. I talk to guys who've been addicted to pornography since they were 8 years old because they had a smartphone and they could look up stuff, and their parents kept no guards on their phones whatsoever. And, in all of mine growing up, I never saw the sex act. Never saw it. And today, by the time a guy's 17 years old, how many times do you think he has seen the sex act? And he's seen genitalia, both genders, thousands of times. You think that has something to do with the erosion of sexual boundaries? Of course it does. And then you've got surgeries that could be performed today that couldn't be performed 30 years ago. Hormone therapies, surgeries, all of this. And it plays right into really something else that happened along our culture. Sigmund Freud had a nephew named Edward Bernays, and Bernays is the father of modern advertising. I think there was Malcolm Gladwell did a podcast about Bernays, I think. It was either him or This American Life. Bernays was the guy, he introduced desire into advertising. He shaped the social imaginary. Smoke this cigarette because you look cool when you do it. And he gave, the Marlboro Man, Virginia Slims, the sleek, elegant woman holding a cigarette. Bernays is the guy that first did that. Drive this car because of how it makes you feel. And you see a car commercial, and there are two kinds of car commercials. There's the car commercial with the beautiful woman beside it, and there's a car commercial with it's on the track or it's going over the rugged mountains or what. But it's always about how you feel. It's not about the technology of the car. It's always about how it makes you feel. So this is where we've come. is like, okay, we're in this now, a new social imaginary where our society has bought into this expressive individualism. Now, you think this doesn't creep into the church? I mean, when Christians start reading the Bible and you listen, the way even preaching has subtly changed, and you just go on the internet and watch advertising from other services and other churches, and they begin to make it about you. I mean, we've got such a consumerism even in churches. I know one church, pastored even by a friend of mine, and their website, they've got 3 different styles of worship services, and you pick your own style, and you go to the one that suits you. Now, I can't see that. I'll just tell you, folks, I can't see that as anything other than it's just failed leadership, a massive failure of leadership. Because we made it about, okay, now you pick what you want, and you end up with different churches all in the same place because everybody gets what they want. And this creeps into our thinking. We read the Bible that way. God's your best friend. God is here to make you authentically you, and you be the best you can be. And instead of it's all about Jesus, and it's all about surrendering to Him, and it's His lordship, and you're taking up a cross. You're dying to self. I mean, an honest reading of the Scripture runs totally counter to this expressive individualism. And I would argue that you are your best self and your most authentic, redeemed self when you are totally surrendered to Christ. And that is our highest and greatest good. And as a Christian, I just have to believe that God, my designer, knows me better than I know myself, and He designed me as He wants me to be, and my goal is to live out my life for His glory within the design that He gave me. And you just have to, by faith, believe that and say yes. Truman goes through really the history of philosophy. He begins with Descartes. Probably, I don't know that anybody here in this room would call yourself a philosopher, but I bet everybody knows one of Descartes' main things, and that is, he said, I think, therefore, I am. Everybody knows that. Je pense, donc je suis, ergo cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. You can put it in any language, and everybody knows it. But I want you to see that what's at the heart even of that statement is doubt that you are. It's like Descartes, you have to prove that you exist. What's the proof you exist? Why are you even thinking about it? That's what I mean, the question is, why are you even doubting your existence? And Descartes, he grounds identity in doubt. I think, therefore I am. Okay, so I'm having to actually prove that I exist. Well, then Rousseau comes along, and Rousseau argues that feelings are central to who we are. Rousseau was radical for his day. He writes the first modern autobiography in which he tells all kinds of stuff about himself. But he basically says that you being who you are, you're living out your feelings, that's the most important thing. And this is radical for his time. He says to the extent that society or culture keeps us from acting in accord with our true self, with our feelings, it makes us inauthentic. And anything that prevents me from being me is my adversary. Now, Rousseau, when he said this, a lot of people went, that's crazy. But today, this is the way it is. A business that won't let a person dress the way they feel makes them inauthentic. A man wants to dress like a woman, you must let him do that, because to do otherwise would to be forcing them to be inauthentic. Schools that have uniforms keep kids from expressing themselves. and by the way, you are hearing parents make those arguments now, even in private schools. I'll tell you a little bit of the history of this. At Southern Seminary, there used to be a school of social work. Now, if you really want to, the accrediting agency of social work, they have basically, if you read their sort of presuppositions, you'll see that they're really incompatible with the seminary that believes in the inerrancy of Scripture. And Southern actually had the Carver School of Social Work, named for one of Southern's very first true liberal faculty members, W.O. Carver. And when Dr. Moeller became president at Southern Seminary in 1993, he knew immediately, he said, we need to get rid of the Carver School of Social Work, but there were some trustees that they weren't so sure. So Moeller arranged for him, one of these trustees, I tell you, it was Jeff Pennington's father, by the way. So you know Jeff Pennington, it was his dad. And Moeller said, you meet with the faculty, ask them anything you want, I won't even be in the room. So he goes in, Dr. Pennington goes in there, and he thinks he's going to, the hot button issues are abortion and homosexuality, and Dr. Moeller told him that we had faculty that believed in those things, and he thought, well, I'll save the hard stuff. Let me build up to it. The first question he asked, he says, okay, so he asked this of the faculty of the Carver School of Social Work, Southern Seminary, 1993. If someone says to you that they are a hired killer, what would you tell them? And he's thinking they would say, well, you'd say you can't do that. And their answer was, we'd ask him, is that really his authentic decision? Dr. Pennington went like, now what? And they said, it's not for us to judge anybody. It's for us to help them find their authentic self. We would probably argue that that's not his most authentic self. But that's for him to discover. And, it went downhill from there. Forget abortion and homosexuality. He didn't even get to those things. He just found out that there was no moral standard of right and wrong outside of the authentic self. Now, that was 1993. And by the way, the president of the accrediting agency of social work schools came to see Dr. Moeller soon after that, and she was a Buddhist nun. And she said to Dr. Moeller, you don't understand. If you don't do what we're telling you, we're going to shut down the Carver School of Social Work. And Dr. Moeller looked at her and said, no, you don't understand. It is my intention to shut down the Carver School of Social Work. And that was sort of, they took away all the ammunition she had. And in fact, they did. And, it was totally incompatible with who we are, but it was exactly where our culture was going. So Rousseau wrote a book called Confessions, and you compare the Confessions of Augustine. In his Confessions, it's all about his depravity and how God finds him in his depravity and saves him. Rousseau's Confessions are about, he tells, I think, about the first time he commits a crime and why he did it. And a man named Virat asked him to steal asparagus from Virat's mother, steal asparagus from her to give to him so that Virat can then sell it and have some money because his mother won't support him. And Virat really, compliments Rousseau and tells him what a fine young man he is. And Rousseau does it. And then he looks back at his crime as he writes Confessions, and he says that, first of all, that he was doing it for a good reason, because he wanted to help someone. So therefore, the moral code of it's wrong to steal does not apply. His motive was to help. But he admits that he did it because he was flattered. And it sort of underlines that the crime is the result of social pressure, not some internal tendency to depravity. So he totally rejects like that people are innately depraved or sinful, and he accepts that no, we're born good, but then there are social pressures that cause us sometimes to do wrong things, but sometimes it's not black and white. Sometimes they look wrong, but they're actually done with good motives, and therefore it's not wrong. Well, obviously with a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, we reject that. The Bible doesn't deny our feelings or our inner self, but it does remind us we cannot trust it. Read the Psalms. The Psalms are painfully honest about feelings, right? The Psalms say, cry out to God, how long, O Lord? Lord, why are you sleeping? I mean, you have all this honest pouring out of soul in the Psalms, and yet in the Psalms in general, Psalm 44 being one exception I've preached on before, but in general, there's a volte in each of the Psalms. There's a turn where, okay, now my soul's going to wait on the Lord. Or it says, I will say to my soul, why are you so downcast? Now think about that. I'm preaching to myself. And the Psalms teach us that when we are down, that we are to speak truth to ourselves. We should preach the gospel to ourselves. There's not a denial of our feelings. There's not even a rebuke of those feelings. Paul in 2 Corinthians says, I don't want you to be uninformed of the hardship I had when I was in Asia, so that I despaired of life itself. There's no whitewashing over this. There's no, it's wrong to feel these things. Oh, come on, smile, things will get better. God's in control. I mean, there's an honesty about feelings and struggle. I mean, we're going to get to Romans 7. I really look forward to getting there, about why is it that I do the things I don't want to do and don't do the things I want to do? Why, who's going to deliver me from the body of this death? The Bible is completely honest about the struggle. It does not in any way diminish it. It does not deny it, but it reminds us that we cannot trust our feelings. We cannot trust ourselves. Think of it like you just look at, you see this in our culture in almost every debate. Any of the main cultural debates today, this is the thing. It's like, think of the gun debate. The idea that we are corrupted by our surroundings, and so we respond accordingly. Every time there's a mass shooting, they want to blame everybody but the shooter. It's like, well, what about, who raised that boy? I mean, let's talk about his parents. Was he bullied at school? And the gun maker, and everybody. I mean, it's like everybody but the guy who did it, and we're always trying to seek reasons for it. And obviously there are a lot of complicating factors. I don't deny that. I'm just saying that there is now this, we want to psychologize every mass criminal, find out, well, who hurt them? What societal forces came upon them? Society and culture are the enemy because it makes us suppress our true self, and we live a lie. And what do you hear so much? Every time I'm on a show or something where I debate anybody about these issues, it's always going to come out, me believing what I believe is causing teenagers to commit suicide. Now, they're never concerned about Christian teenagers, but if you say this about LGBTQ stuff, teenagers commit suicide. And, this is where Christians have to be compassionate. Let's teach kids not to bully. Let's teach kids kindness, but we can't not speak the truth. So this is, I think, the challenge before us, is that how we live in this world that sort of come to us through, Rousseau sort of won the day. In the day he was looked at as crazy, but now this kind of thinking is what dominates our our social identity, the way we think about the modern self. Now, I'm sort of going quickly through his first two chapters because I really want to get to I'm covering basically his first four chapters in 2 weeks, and then we'll take a week with each chapter thereafter. But throwing out a lot of stuff today, and I know I didn't answer everything you wanted, and we're still going some places. But any questions about what I've said thus far? Yeah, you mentioned Rousseau, the fact that Rousseau gave away all of it. He put all of his children in an orphanage. It's like soon after they were born. That's right. 5 children, and put them in an orphanage, which I'm assuming none of them made it to adulthood, frankly. But now you think about this. Let's say that a man that's a father of 5 children comes home today and tells his wife and children, I've been living a lie. I'm really a woman trapped in a man's body, and I need to be my authentic self. What does culture say to that wife her response should be? I mean, seriously. Culture says you need to support him, you need to give him his freedom, and if it means leaving you and his kids, I remember when, yeah, but if you take a vow to love and live together as long as, we both shall live, but now you say, oh, that's not my authentic self. Society says you're supposed to go along with that. When Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner, I forget which one of his kids admitted that it was hard for her to take and was pummeled on social media, like, how dare you? And she felt like at the time, well, I've lost a dad here. And, well, you need to get with the program. But what nobody said was this father owes it to his children to do something. Nobody argued that he owed something to his kids. What he owed was to himself to be who he is, or she is, as the culture would say. And so this is a total flip. I mean, I grew up in a time where, a dad was to be a dad, and it was like no matter how hard it was and how many hours you worked or whatever, you had to put food on the table, and it wasn't about your authentic self, it was about you meeting your obligations. That is gone. And it's about your authentic self. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Chris. This is where I think Christianity has always been countercultural. And again, this is why I think in the unique moment of the United States of America, we weren't really countercultural because regardless of what anybody says, this country was founded on Christian principles. I would argue it's not a Christian nation. I get that. But there's clearly the laws of this country were founded on Christian principles. I mean, right from our founding documents, the assumption of a creator, and this creator has given every person inalienable rights. That's just the bedrock of our country. So we've not been accustomed to being as countercultural as we're about to be. And so Christians we need to buckle in and understand at some point, some of us are going to jail for preaching against homosexuality and transgenderism. Canada's already done it, and a church in Indiana, one of my students, their counseling center at their church in Indiana, their city council passed ordinance that that even religious counselors could not tell people that they should repent of homosexuality. I think that they had to back down on that, but I'm just saying it's coming. It's coming, and I talked to our church planners in places like California and all that, and the cultural challenge before them. And we've also all got to be honest, is that our children in public schools are being indoctrinated with this. One of my professors at Southern Seminary, his wife teaches in Jefferson County Public Schools, and he said this year has to take 24 diversity trainings. Now, you know what? I'm all for cultural diversity when it means like we're seeing the image of God in everybody, and we're being kind to everybody, and we value ethnicity, and I'm all for that kind of diversity. But you and I know that's not the only kind of diversity they're talking about, and the fact that there is more confusion now among teenagers about their identity and gender identity. And I'm telling you, it's just, when I was a youth pastor in the 1980s, there was never concern like, a bunch of girls in a room together, just never thought about anything sexual happening. And I'm telling you, I talk to youth pastors all the time now who are telling me horror stories of stuff happening on their youth outings because our children are just being conditioned sexually to be experimental and to express themselves, and it is incredibly challenging. So this is why the church has to, first of all, we can't just stick our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening, because it's a freight train coming our way from within. And if churches don't talk about it and don't teach about it, 10 years down the road, they will have lost the gospel. I really do believe that. I don't think that's an overstatement, because once you say, we don't accept what the Bible says about God's design in humanity between male and female, we don't accept God's design in marriage, are you really going to accept his design in salvation? Are you really going to say that Jesus is the only way of salvation? You're willing to say Jesus is the only way of salvation. The Bible gets that right, but it gets this gender and marriage stuff wrong. I just don't think a church will do that. There really is a domino effect here, and this is why we have to teach and confront this now and say we accept all the Word of God. And I'll just tell you, someone who's sort of on the way out, I'm very insistent that I don't want to leave my successor any issues with this like unresolved. I don't want it to be because I wasn't vocal and I didn't teach, and so suddenly he has on his hands some insurrection of a large group of people in the church say, oh, well, we didn't know this is what Buck Run stood for. So I'm being real clear what we stand for, because we're teaching what we've always taught about the Scripture. And I think it's really, really important. Well, next week I'm going to take up with chapter 3 in Strange New World. We'll try and cover 3 and 4, and then slow down a little bit after that. We're getting through the sort of the philosophical underpinnings first, and then we'll be talking about specific issues for today. All right?